The towering chamber of the Galactic Council was eerily silent as the accused was led into the center of the circular courtroom. Chains clinked softly against the smooth obsidian floor, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Seated in tiers above him were representatives from 100 star systems, their eyes fixated on the lone human standing in the accused pit. Among them, reptilian dignitaries from the Xel'Naga Empire hissed in contempt. Avian diplomats from the Kurith Collective ruffled their metallic feathers, and the biomechanical judges of the Veil Consortium observed in perfect stillness, their glowing optical sensors locked onto the prisoner. Jonathan Kessler, the man at the center of the storm, lifted his gaze, scanning the faces of his supposed judges. At 60 years old, his face was weathered but unreadable, a mask of quiet confidence and defiance. A silver streak ran through his dark hair, and his stance, despite the shackles binding his wrists, was unervingly relaxed. He did not cower. He did not plead. He simply watched, as if evaluating them rather than the other way around. The lead judge, High Arbiter Zeloth, a towering figure draped in ceremonial crimson robes, leaned forward. His golden eyes narrowed, his forked tongue flickering in and out as he regarded the human. Jonathan Kessler, designated war criminal by the Galactic Concordance, you stand accused of heinous acts against the interstellar community. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the chamber. Murder, genocide, the systematic destabilization of entire planetary governments. Do you deny these charges? Jonathan tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He said nothing. The murmur of the council grew louder. Some whispered in hushed tones. Others glared at him with open hostility. Silence, Zeloth commanded, slamming his gavel-like appendage against the panel before him. His gaze remained locked onto the human. Very well. If you choose not to speak, we will allow the evidence to do so in your stead. A holographic display flickered to life in the center of the chamber. Images appeared, grainy security footage, intercepted transmissions, battlefield reports. They showed the aftermath of massacres, the smoldering ruins of military installations. Entire fleets burned to nothingness. One after another, clips played of Kessler's supposed war crimes, painting a picture of ruthless efficiency. His code name appeared in red text, The Revenant. The title alone sent a ripple of unease through the gathered assembly. Jonathan exhaled, long and slow, before shifting his weight. That's quite the show you've put together. His voice, calm and measured, cut through the chamber. I'm flattered. The words hung in the air. Zeloth's gaze darkened. Do you find amusement in the suffering of countless beings, human? A new voice rang out, this one sharp and accusing. Counselor Vadron, a skeletal, multi-eyed being from the Triarch Dominion, leaned forward. You see these images and feel no remorse? Jonathan held his gaze. You have no idea what you're looking at. A hush fell over the room. Zeloth's patience thinned. Then enlighten us, he said coldly. Because what we see is a monster who has walked unpunished for far too long. Jonathan chuckled, a low, rasping sound devoid of humor. A monster. He rolled the word over his tongue as if considering it. His eyes, a steel gray storm, locked onto the High Arbiters. Tell me, Zeloth, how many of your own people are alive today because of the decisions I made? The room stiffened. Even Zeloth faltered for a fraction of a second before regaining his composure. You expect us to believe you acted in the interest of peace? Vadron scoffed. The only thing your kind has ever brought to the stars is destruction. Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. No, he said quietly. What I brought was survival. Silence stretched, taut and heavy. Then a new presence entered the chamber, a uniformed officer, his face pale with barely concealed alarm. He moved swiftly to Zeloth's side, whispering something into the High Arbiter's ear. Whatever was said made the reptilian's golden eyes widen, his ridged brow furrowing in what could only be described as fear. Jonathan watched them carefully, his expression unreadable. Zeloth turned back to the assembly. For the first time, his voice lacked its earlier certainty. It appears, he said, slowly and deliberately, that we have made a grave miscalculation. A murmur of confusion spread through the chamber. Jonathan's smirk widened just slightly. The officer stepped forward, clearing his throat before addressing the council. "We have accessed further classified records regarding the accused," he announced, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Records that were hidden even from this governing body." "Explain," Zeloth demanded, his tone sharp. The officer hesitated. "Jonathan Kessler is not merely a soldier. He was part of an off-the-books unit known as Project Revenant. His actions were not rogue. They were sanctioned at the highest levels of intergalactic security." A shocked silence followed. Some of the counselors looked at one another in disbelief. Zeloth's gaze snapped back to Jonathan. "Is this true?" Jonathan said nothing, but the glint in his eyes was answer enough. The officer swallowed. "Furthermore, recent intelligence suggests that an unidentified fleet is en route to this very location. Their arrival is imminent." He hesitated before delivering the final blow. "And their transmissions are referring to Kessler by name." The chamber erupted into chaos. "Enough." Zeloth slammed his gavel down. "Lock down this facility. Increase planetary defenses at once." His gaze darted back to Kessler, filled with suspicion and a flicker of something else. Dread. "What have you done?" Jonathan finally exhaled, stretching his fingers as if testing the weight of his shackles. He took a step forward, causing the guards to instinctively raise their weapons. "I told you," he said, his voice calm amid the turmoil. "You have no idea what you're looking at." And for the first time that day, the Galactic Council truly understood fear. A heavy silence settled over the council chamber, the kind that wrapped itself around the walls and pressed into the lungs of those within. The council members no longer sat in quiet judgment. Now there was unease, a shifting of bodies, a flicker of something unspoken in their eyes. Jonathan Kessler stood in the center of it all, still shackled, still calm. His expression remained unreadable, though there was an undeniable shift in the room's balance. The weight of knowledge had tilted, and it no longer leaned against him. Zeloth's fingers curled against the table before him. "Project Revenant," he repeated, the words barely a whisper, as if speaking them aloud made them more dangerous. A sharp intake of breath came from one of the counselors, a hunched, insectoid being whose mandibles twitched in nervous calculation. That cannot be," he murmured. "The Revenant was a myth, a war story told to scare fools." Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle. "You always assume the worst truths are just stories." His gaze lifted, slow and deliberate. "That's how people like me survive." Zeloth's eyes narrowed. "Enlighten us, then. If we are so ignorant, educate us. Who are you, truly? What is Project Revenant?" Jonathan exhaled through his nose, tilting his head as if considering the demand. He rolled his shoulders slightly, testing the weight of the shackles before speaking. 50 years ago, humanity was still young in the stars," he said, his voice even measured. "We were explorers, merchants, diplomats. Idealists, some would say. We believed the universe was full of potential allies, waiting to be found." A pause, just long enough to let the next words land with weight. "Then we met the Draken." A hush swept through the room at the name. The Draken Empire, the war machine, the conquerors, the species that had nearly shattered the galactic balance not so long ago. Even those who had never faced them firsthand knew the weight that name carried. Jonathan watched their reactions, eyes flicking over each face before continuing. "You know the stories. The planets they burned, the species they enslaved. What you don't know is how close they came to wiping humanity off the map before we even had a chance to fight back." His voice remained steady, but something lurked beneath the surface, something raw, something old. "They didn't see us as a threat," he said. "Why would they? We were outnumbered, outgunned, years behind in military technology. They hit our colonies first, swept through them like a storm. Some surrendered and were crushed under their rule. Others fought and were eradicated." His jaw tightened slightly. "I was there when Terrace 9 fell, when the sky burned, and my squad was left behind in the ruins." Zeloth studied him carefully. You survived. Jonathan met his gaze. I did more than that. There was no boast in his tone, no bravado, just a simple statement of fact. They left us there, thought we were dead. We were young, untrained for what came next. But survival has a way of turning men into something else. We scavenged from their wreckage, learned how their weapons worked, how they moved, how they thought. We weren't an army. We weren't even soldiers anymore. We were ghosts in their territory. We hit their supply chains, took their commanders out in the dead of night, turned their own war machines against them. His eyes darkened. It took a full year to realize that their unstoppable warpath had been halted, not by fleets, not by an empire, but by a handful of humans too stubborn to die. The room was motionless, entranced by the words spilling from a supposed war criminal's mouth. That's when they gave me the name, he continued. The Revenant. Because no matter what they did, no matter how many times they thought I was dead, I kept coming back. A mechanical counselor, its face an impassive metal plate, finally spoke. You led an insurgency against an empire, it said. And yet history does not mark you as its hero. Why? Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Because a hero fights a war to win. I fought it to end. Zeloth's grip on his gavel tightened. Explain. Jonathan let out a slow breath. I had a choice. Humanity could keep bleeding, keep fighting a war we had no chance of winning. Or he let the word linger before continuing. I could take the fight to them in a way they had never seen before. The air grew heavier. What did you do? Jonathan's voice remained steady, but the words carried something heavier than steel. I made them afraid. Silence. I found their homeworld, their ruling caste, the ones who sat in comfort while their war machine ground worlds to dust. I took their families, their heirs, their legacies, and I made them watch as their empire began to fracture, as their people started turning against them. His fingers curled slightly, and when their leaders had nothing left to lose, I made them an offer. I gave them a way out, surrender, withdraw from human space, disappear into the shadows of history, or watch everything they built burn. The council chamber was suffocatingly quiet. Zeloth's voice was quieter now, though no less firm. And they took the deal. Jonathan nodded. They took the deal. A long pause stretched between them, the weight of the story pressing into every corner of the room. Finally, one of the younger counselors spoke, hesitant but unable to hold back the question. If you ended the war, he said, if you saved humanity, why are you here in shackles? Why does the galaxy remember you as a monster instead of a savior? Jonathan exhaled slowly, as if considering whether the truth was worth saying. Then he looked up, and there was no hesitation in his eyes. Because peace isn't profitable. Zeloth's expression remained unreadable, but something had shifted behind his eyes. The council members glanced at one another, uncertain, shaken. Jonathan flexed his fingers once, the faintest trace of tension in his shoulders. The war ended, and suddenly the people in power, the ones who built their empires on fear, on the threat of war, they needed an enemy. They needed a villain, someone to blame for the things they had let happen. He shrugged, the chains rattling against his wrists. So they made me one. Another long silence. Then the officer who had brought the classified files earlier stepped forward again, his expression troubled. There's more, he said. More in the records we decrypted. Zeloth turned to him. Speak. The officer hesitated, then took a slow breath. The fleet en route to this system, it isn't an invasion force. He glanced at Jonathan before continuing. It's human. A ripple of shock spread through the room. Zeloth's jaw tightened. Why would humanity send a fleet here now? Jonathan finally smiled, slow and knowing. Because they know what you just learned. The officer hesitated before speaking again. They're demanding his immediate release. A final hush fell over the room. Zeloth's fingers curled against the panel before him, his gaze locked onto Jonathan. The council chamber, once a place of judgment, had become something else entirely, a battlefield where words were the only weapons. And Jonathan Kessler, bound in chains yet utterly in control, had just reminded them all of what they had tried so hard to forget. The Revenant had never been theirs to judge. The weight of the revelation hung over the chamber like an approaching storm. The council, once so assured of its authority, now sat in uneasy silence, glancing between one another as if hoping someone else would take control of the situation. The fleet was coming. A human fleet. Not as conquerors, not as aggressors, but with a singular demand: Jonathan Kessler's release. Zelotha's fingers drummed against the table before him, his golden eyes narrowing in careful thought. "This is a diplomatic nightmare," he muttered under his breath. The officer who had delivered the news shifted uncomfortably. "We intercepted their latest transmission," he said. "They're holding position just beyond the outer defense perimeter. Their commander has requested direct communication with the council." Jonathan smirked. "I'd take that call if I were you." Zeloth shot him a glare, but gave a curt nod to the communications officer. A moment later, a new holographic display flickered to life, and the image of a man appeared, hard-faced, sharp-eyed, clad in the uniform of a high-ranking human naval officer. The insignia on his chest gleamed under the dim light of the chamber. "This is Admiral Elias Monroe of the Terran Defense Fleet," the man announced, his voice clipped and formal. His dark eyes swept over the gathered officials before settling on Jonathan. "Revenant." Jonathan dipped his head slightly. "Monroe." Zeloth straightened in his seat, forcing authority into his posture. "Admiral Monroe, you are trespassing in restricted space. Your fleet's presence here is a direct violation of intergalactic treaty." Monroe's expression didn't shift. "And your imprisonment of Jonathan Kessler is a direct violation of something far more important." He let that hang for a moment before continuing. "We have reviewed the classified files your people conveniently forgot to acknowledge. The charges against him are baseless. Worse than that, they were fabricated by the very powers who benefited from his silence. I believe you now understand the depth of your mistake." Zelotha's jaw clenched, but before he could reply, another voice cut through the chamber. "It's not just a mistake." All eyes turned toward the speaker, Counselor Vadran, the same one who had so harshly condemned Kessler earlier. But now, his multi-eyed gaze was fixed on something far beyond the room, a cold calculation creeping into his tone. "We assumed this was a matter of justice. But this was never about Jonathan Kessler at all." The insectoid counselor turned toward Zeloth. "You feel it, don't you? Something is wrong." The chamber, already tense, grew heavier. Jonathan's smirk faded. "Tell them." Vadran hesitated only a moment before speaking. "There are ships in the void, ones we cannot see, but they are there." His mandibles clicked together as if tasting the fear in the air. "Something has been moving in the deep reaches of space. I felt the disturbance before, but now it is undeniable. A presence old and patient, waiting for the right moment." The room was deathly silent. Zelotha's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting an unknown fleet is present near our system?" "I'm suggesting we are about to be tested in a way we are not prepared for." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "You should listen to him." Zeloth shot him a glare. "And why would you know anything about this?" Jonathan's expression was unreadable. "Because I've seen them before." The words sent a chill through the chamber. Monroe, still visible on the holographic display, leaned in slightly. "Explain." Jonathan's jaw tightened, as if recalling something buried deep in memory. "They aren't like the Draken. They don't conquer, don't make demands. They don't send ultimatums or negotiate treaties." He paused, his voice losing its usual sharpness, replaced by something almost reluctant. "They consume." The word lingered, settling into the bones of everyone present. Zelotha's usual confidence wavered, his clawed fingers curling against the table. "Who are they?" Jonathan let out a slow breath. "We called them the Hollow." Vadran made a low, clicking sound, something akin to a gasp. "That cannot be." Jonathan turned his gaze toward him. "You know the stories?" Vadran's mandibles twitched in unease. "Stories, yes. Whispers of an ancient force. Something that does not leave ruins, only silence." His eyes darted around the chamber. "No confirmed encounters. No survivors." Jonathan nodded. Until now. The chamber erupted into a flurry of voices. Council members debated, questioned, doubted. Fear was an unwelcome guest, but it had settled into the air, and no one could ignore it. Zeloth slammed his gavel down. Enough. He turned back to Jonathan. If what you claim is true, why have we not detected them? Jonathan exhaled. Because they don't arrive like an invading army. They're already here, watching, learning, waiting for you to be too distracted to notice. Zeloth's gaze darkened. And how do you know this? Jonathan's voice was quiet. Because that's how they came for us, too. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Zeloth's face. The council chamber's main console suddenly blared with an alert, an emergency signal flooding in from the outer planetary defense grid. The communications officer, pale and visibly shaken, rushed forward. High Arbiter, we have multiple contacts emerging on the edge of the system. They weren't on our sensors a moment ago, but now, his voice trembled. Now they are everywhere. A new display flickered to life, showing the incoming fleet. But this was not the Terran Defense Fleet. The vessels on the screen were unlike anything the Council had seen before, black voids in the fabric of space itself, their forms shifting and unnatural, as if they barely existed within the confines of physical reality. Monroe's voice came through the comms, tight with urgency. That's them. Zeloth stared at the screen, the cold realization settling in. By the stars. Jonathan's voice cut through the noise. You need to let me go. Zeloth's gaze snapped to him. You expect us to believe you can fight that? Jonathan's expression didn't waver. I expect you to believe that I've spent the last 20 years preparing for it. The ship alerts intensified. The hollow fleet was moving, shifting, drawing closer. The outer defenses were coming online, but it was clear the automated systems had never been designed for an enemy like this. Zeloth gritted his teeth, his mind warring with itself. Every instinct screamed against trusting the human, against surrendering authority to the very man they had sought to condemn. But the reality was undeniable. Vadran was the first to speak. High Arbiter, we have no other option. Zeloth closed his eyes for a brief moment before exhaling sharply. Release him. Guards hesitated. Now. The shackles unlocked, clattering to the ground. Jonathan flexed his wrists before rolling his shoulders. He glanced at Monroe's image. Tell your people to hold the line. I'll be with them soon. Monroe gave a single nod before the transmission cut. Jonathan turned back to the council, his expression unreadable. You wanted a villain. He stepped forward, the weight of old battles settling onto his shoulders. Now you need a savior. The hollow came as a whisper in the dark, slipping past defenses as if they had always been there, waiting. The alarm screamed across the station as the black void ships drifted forward, their forms shifting and writhing like living shadows. The outer defense grid opened fire first, lances of plasma and kinetic rounds streaking toward the enemy. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the weapons would strike true. Then, without warning, the rounds simply vanished. Jonathan Kessler had seen it before. The Hollow did not fight in conventional ways. They did not raise shields, did not deploy countermeasures. Instead, their ships devoured everything. Energy, matter, even the very space around them. The weapons meant to destroy them never landed, their impact stolen away by the unnatural abyss. Zeloth stood frozen, watching the main tactical display with the weight of a man witnessing the impossible. Vadran's mandibles clicked in unspoken dread. Even Monroe, hardened by war, was silent over the comms as the realization settled upon them. The defense fleet responded next, human warships breaking formation to engage. Lines of battleships moved into position, their railguns and beam weapons firing in coordinated strikes. But again, the Hollow absorbed all. Their void ships advanced unhindered, as if reality itself bent to their will. Jonathan pulled a guard sidearm from its holster, checking the charge before striding toward the main exit. "Where do you think you're going?" Zeloth's voice was sharp, but there was no arrogance left in it, only uncertainty. Jonathan didn't stop walking. To do what needs to be done. The station trembled as something unseen brushed against it, a presence vast and unfathomable. The lights flickered. The Hollow were not merely invaders. They were wrong, an intrusion into the fabric of existence. The council chamber doors hissed open, and Jonathan stepped through, his boots echoing against the steel floor as he moved with unshaken purpose. The guards hesitated, looking to Zeloth for orders. But the High Arbiter said nothing. Monroe's voice crackled over the comms. "Revenant, if you have a plan, now would be a good time." Jonathan keyed into the station's central comms. "Order the fleet to pull back. Don't waste time trying to destroy what won't die. We need to sever their hold before they fully manifest." Vadron's voice broke through, disbelief laced in his tone. "Sever their hold? You speak as if they are not physical entities." Jonathan reached an armory station, keying in an override. Lockers slid open, revealing weapons of various makes. He reached for a pulse rifle, slinging it over his shoulder. Because they aren't. Not entirely. The Hollow aren't just invaders. They're a corruption, a wound in space itself. Zeloth and the Council watched from the monitors, their expressions grim. And how do you stop something like that? Jonathan loaded a fresh energy cell into the rifle. "You don't fight them like an army." He turned back toward the monitors, his gaze unwavering. "You cut out the infection." The station's AI pinged a new warning. The Hollow fleet had reached the outer platforms. But more than that, something else was emerging, a shape unlike the others. Monroe's voice was tight. "Central entity detected. It's enormous." Jonathan's jaw clenched. There it is. The Hollow did not have leaders in the traditional sense. They had cores, anchors, centralized entities that served as their focal points. Destroying one wouldn't end them entirely, but it would break their hold, weaken their presence enough to force them back. Zeloth studied the display, his expression unreadable. You knew this was coming. Jonathan met his gaze through the screen. "I spent decades preparing for this. I just didn't think I'd be doing it in chains." Without another word, he stepped into the station's docking bay. Monroe's fleet had begun a strategic retreat, pulling back to defensive positions, buying time. Jonathan entered a fighter bay, moving past sleek interceptors to an older ship, one that shouldn't have been there. A personal dropship. His dropship. The Revenant's vessel had been locked away for years, hidden under bureaucracy and red tape. But someone had made sure it remained operational. He traced his fingers over the hull before stepping inside, the systems lighting up at his presence. Monroe's voice returned. "Revenant, what are you planning?" Jonathan keyed in his flight vector, locking onto the central entity. Something stupid. The bay doors opened, and the ship launched forward, cutting through the void toward the Hollow's core. The entity loomed ahead, a mass of twisting void energy, shifting in and out of reality. The closer he got, the colder it became, as if the ship itself was being drained. Inside the cockpit, Jonathan activated a hidden compartment. A device emerged from the console, its surface etched with runes, old technology mixed with new. A relic from the war, a weapon built in secret. Humanity had encountered the Hollow before. And in those forgotten battles, they had learned something vital. The Hollow fed on energy, on matter, on existence itself. But there were frequencies, pulses of reality that they could not absorb, because they were never meant to exist within them. Jonathan's fingers hovered over the activation switch. "Monroe," he said over the comms. The Admiral's voice was tight. "We're here." Jonathan exhaled. "If this works, tell them I wasn't the villain." Then he activated the device. A pulse rippled outward, not an explosion, not a weapon in the conventional sense, but a disruption in reality itself. The Hollow screamed, not in sound, but in sensation, a psychic wail that reverberated through space. The entity convulsed, its form unraveling. The Hollow ships began to distort, their unnatural presence breaking apart as the pulse continued to spread. Jonathan's vision blurred as the cockpit systems overloaded, warning lights flashing across the display. His ship trembled, caught in the very force he had unleashed. Monroe's voice was distant. "Revenant, Jonathan, can you pull out?" The ship's controls flickered, the hull groaning under the pressure. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the stick, but the gravitational forces were pulling him toward the collapsing entity. The hollow were being erased, and he was going with them. A sharp breath. His mind raced. He had always known this was how it might end. But as the ship spiraled toward the void, something else appeared on his sensors. Another ship. Fast. Unmarked. Moving straight toward him. A transmission cut through the interference. A voice he hadn't heard in years. "Not today, old man." The impact jolted him as the secondary ship's grappling beam locked onto his vessel, pulling him free from the collapsing anomaly. The ship jerked violently, the G-forces pressing against his chest, but then silence. He was free. The hollow were gone. The fleet was intact. And as his ship stabilized, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The comms flared again. Zelotha's voice, shaken but steady. "It's over." Jonathan leaned back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. He glanced at the other ship, the one that had pulled him out. No markings. No identification. Just a shadow in the stars. A voice echoed once more before cutting out. "See you around, Revenant." Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Maybe, just maybe, the galaxy wasn't done with him yet.